Hello, everyone. I'm Dan Goodstein, and welcome to the Digital Leader Show, where each week we discuss key issues and news at the intersection of business, technology, and the humanities in hopes of making you a better digital leader as we all transform to digital enterprises and a full-on digital society. We're live each Wednesday at noon Eastern, 9 Pacific, 6 Central European Time on YouTube, LinkedIn, and Twitter, and the recording is available on major podcast platforms the following week. I head up the Digital Enterprise Institute and ERPA AI, the Institute for RPA and Artificial Intelligence. My co-host is Carlos Alvarenga. Carlos is the Chief Research Officer for Digital Enterprise Institute. He's an author, an educator at the Robert H. Smith School of Business, University of Maryland, and Georgetown University. And he's also a former advisor from Accenture. Carlos, good to see you again.
Good afternoon, Dan. Great to be back.
So once again, we're continuing our series focusing on a few key topics that are part of our DEI Weekly. It's a curated selection of our favorite content for digital leaders that goes out to members each week. And you can sign up if you're not already a member at DEInetwork.com. Carlos, the big story I wanted to talk about this week is actually one we touched upon last week, but really didn't get into the weeds on it. So there was this last month. There was this court ruling. It was a Texas law that was upheld by the appellate court, Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, basically saying that online platforms in the U.S. no longer have First Amendment rights regarding editorial decisions. A lot of people, including this article in The Atlantic that came out, are calling this the demise of the internet as we know it. The court is saying this moderation is censorship. That seems to be the other side of it. Interesting debate, no?
Interesting debate because it goes back to the kind of the heart of obviously free speech, right? And then the sense of what are these platforms really are. And they've always had it kind of both ways, right? Which on the one hand, they say we're not publishers. We don't create the content. We're a platform that allows other people to publish, but then they edit. So how can you be, I think what the court is sort of saying in a roundabout way is, how can you be an editor and yet at the same time not be a publisher, right? You either are or you're not. And the minute you start changing what somebody says or taking someone off a platform, then you're now a publisher, and therefore you're subject to the traditional rules that publishers have had to follow for a century. So it certainly is, if it were to proceed forward, and a lot of people who are very skeptical that it will, because it's just the complexity of what it would create on the internet if it were to become the law of the land, right? If you follow it to a large conclusion, the internet as we know it today, yeah, it would die, right? It would not continue it in the current form that it has, which for a lot of people, right, Dan, may not be a bad thing.
So it stems from this, to catch everybody up, right? For those who aren't familiar, right? It comes from this kind of Section 230 of the Communications Act, right? Which more or less says you're not responsible for what other people post on your platform within reason, right? But that within reason has always kind of been up for debate.
Right, and then you get into the question of what is the obligation of the platform owner, right, to police, quote unquote, right, the content that flows through its platforms. And there's so much of it now, and most of it being video, because as we know, right, I think as of right now, 82% of internet traffic is video. And so as we move to the internet becomes video centric, then it's really about policing images, the moving image, as much as it is words going forward. So it is that great question of whose responsibility is it to make sure that what's being broadcast on these platforms, which shape social discourse and our modern life, is not crossing boundaries that as a society we don't want them to cross. Is it the individual poster? Is it the platform itself? One of the things that I think is a real issue too is that a lot of critics of the platforms, right, only critique when they don't like what's being censored, right? So this goes back to when I was first started as a journalist. You started in media too, and one of the early pieces of advice I got from an old Wall Street Journal pro was never get too excited when someone likes your piece, because it just means that you wrote what they thought. So people will think your piece was terrible when they disagree with the idea, and they think your piece is great if you said what they were thinking. So I think too much of this censorship debate is, well, if you're letting my voices come through, then I'm happy. If you're not stopping the other voices, then I'm unhappy, and suddenly you become a censor.
Yeah, and it goes back to our previous debate about who has the right to be that censor, right? I think, when I first read this article and this ruling, I was defensive of I was kind of against the ruling, thinking, hey, this is gonna kind of create the wild west. But then I started going back to some of these recent conversations that we've had on this show, even around who gets to make these decisions. And if it's not the platforms, then who is it? Is it the government? Is it who ultimately gets to do these things? But at the end of the day, isn't it a First Amendment right? Isn't it, if these platforms, as we talked about last week, become the new town square, virtually, then
Right.
shouldn't they have the same rights as the actual town square where you're supposed to have these First Amendment
Well,
rights?
Times Square was always policed, right? To some extent, there's never been an absolute right to free speech in this country. And there's a famous case called Whitney v. California, which was I think 1927 was the case, and there was a woman who was one of the founders of the California Communist Party, and there was a law saying that if you belong to a group that advocated for violence or violent overthrow of the government, then that was a crime. She was convicted. She appealed to the Supreme Court. The conviction was upheld, but Judge Brandeis wrote an opinion in which he laid out a very interesting argument. He said, I'm going to agree that she's guilty, but keep in mind that for the future, unless there is a clear and present danger, right, the government should not be abridging free speech. And he has this amazing line in the opinion, which is the cure to bad speech is more speech, right? And so unless there's a bomb that's going to explode in the next 5 minutes, then people should be allowed to say what they have to say. If you really think it's that terrible, then engage them, right? Engage them in debate. And unless I'm wrong, I think Whitney v. California sort of framed what we now think of as kind of the general concept of free speech sort of in this country. There's always been limits to that, right? And
Yeah.
the issue is on the internet. I think it's two things. One is who sets the limits, but also a libertarian would say, look, just don't go on Facebook. Don't go on Twitter. If you really hate it that much, if you hate the content, don't go on 4chan. Don't go on Discord, right? No one's making you be on these social platforms. The counter argument might be it's not like a copy of the Wall Street Journal, right? They have so much influence on society that they play a different role than a traditional newspaper publisher or a book publisher, which you could ignore if you really wanted to. It's kind of hard to ignore all social media's effect on society, even if you wanted to.
Yeah, I mean, I get the, you can't yell fire in a crowded theater, right? There's
Right.
certain limitations to the First Amendment rights. But I guess my point is, shouldn't the First Amendment rights that are afforded in a physical location be the same as in a digital, virtual location? And part of me feels like, so much of the polarization that's happened over the last few years since the first time that the term fake news was uttered into the universe, is that people, for better or for worse, for right or for wrong, have never distrusted institutions more than they do now, I think. And so, it makes you wonder, take the legalities out for a second. What's better for society? Is it better to have a completely uncensored room that people can see everything and say that guy's an idiot and that guy's smart, right? Versus this perception that this platform is bad and this platform is good because of the way they censor?
Well, I get it. I think it comes down to, do you have a material, the real ability to ignore this platform, right? Can you really say that if you don't care about what's happening on Facebook or on Twitter, then just don't log on. No one forces you to have an account. So there should be no censorship of these kinds of things. Or do we say, look, there are just lines of society we draw, and that anyone who has any kind of, call it public platform, right, has a social responsibility to stop a speaker or a communicator kind of when they cross that line, whether it's a town square, whether it's Clubhouse, right, Discord, or whatever it happens to be. It seems to me that it kind of comes down to that. Where as a society do we say lies that responsibility, right? When the individual, up to the point where the individual seems incapable of understanding where the boundaries are, at which point society appoints or requests, right, that the platform owner step in on behalf of society, not on behalf of the platform. This to me is, there would be the way I would argue the case. I'm not a lawyer, but I would say when the platform steps in to silence something, it doesn't do it on behalf of itself. It does it on behalf of a society that said saying these kinds of things, making these kinds of comments are not allowed by us. We as a society don't want this speech to be broadcast to the world. You can think if you want, and you can publish it in private, but you can't do it in a public space, right?
Yeah, I agree with that. I think, to play devil's advocate, I think the other side's problem with that is that they think that the censorship is politically motivated. That entities like a Twitter, or name your favorite platform, are pushing a social a political agenda. And therefore, they're not doing it based on the greater good. They're doing it based on their own views or perspectives of what is truth and what is not truth.
So in that case, right, it's not about censorship because both sides are okay with it. Then it's only the motivation for the censorship in that case, right? Then we're arguing a different issue. We all agree that censorship is okay when it's needed. So the only question is, okay, who gets to be the censor, and
Right.
under what, and under what conditions? And that's really where the issue begins, right? So is it the private enterprise? And by the way, these are publicly traded companies. We're not talking about a federally funded space, right? It's private company owned by private shareholders. So we get into the issue of, like, it's free enterprise, right? If the company wants to, see, the other crazy part, there's some of the people who advocate for censorship are the same ones who say free enterprise is the most important thing as the capitalist country. Well, if that's the case, then it's the company, which is owned by private individuals, who's making these rules. Why is it okay for a company to decline to do A, B, or C, or to do some other thing, but in this case, a private entity that has no public ownership can't make up its own rules as well? There's some
Well, that changed, right? We often talk about this kind of golden age of journalism, but the reality was that in 1963, those airwaves were controlled by the government, right? And you had to play by the rules. If I don't know if it was censorship, but it was certainly regulation. You had to follow certain rules if you wanted to have a nightly broadcast. You had to give X amount of time to the president, to the debates, to whatever. And there were certain guidelines as to what you could and couldn't do on the air. Right now, there really is no regulatory body, I don't think, for the content of the web, and for social media to say, hey, you can't say that. You can't do that on public airwaves, or what the equivalent is now.
Media, there was always if you want to call it a guardrail, in Spanish we would call it the fence, right? The corral, right? And so the corral used to be pretty narrow, like to your point, right? The FCC had a pretty tight control on where things went. There was always censorship in the sense that they were censors. That was their job. You couldn't. There was a time you married people you couldn't show a double bed, right? They were married. All these old 50 shows where the husband and wife,
right.
beds. So what you have today is, when the online world came, is right. Where is the fence? And it seems like there's the fence. Since there was no social fence, the platforms began to put up fences, but the way they did it, which was inconsistent, right, and in a kind of hodgepodge way, and also often very reactionary, is what was the problem, I think, in the big platforms. Had they from the very beginning said, look, this is what's allowed no matter who you are, and when you say these kinds of things, you're crossing lines that we're not going to allow, then that's the case. And by the way, just the way there are some companies, I think about apps, right? So I've worked on apps before, and apps are a really interesting counterpart because Apple has always been 100% clear that it is a family-friendly brand, and so it doesn't want anything that contradicts that on the App Store, right? And so they are ruthless about their approval process and about making sure that you're not violating what they consider to be the brand ethics. I don't hear anybody complaining about Apple. Apple censors apps every single day that don't fit with what they consider to be family culture. So that's okay, right? The App Store is one of the most heavily censored, if you want to call it censored as in somebody
Control, yeah.
right controls the content, right? It's way more censored than any other social media platform, but it's a marginal issue. Whereas Facebook and Twitter will light up, right, the internet the minute somebody says something which someone else doesn't like.
So I have an idea. I have the solution. For once, I'm gonna put out a solution instead of having to talk about all the problems that we have.
Right.
I think there has to be categorization, right? I think these businesses, these websites, these platforms have to declare what business they're in, right? Because I think the rules should be different for a media company who is going to purport their content as journalism and as information versus a platform that is really a community of individuals who are not necessarily experts, credentialed, or what have you. And I think if the user knows that going in, right, they can say, "Hey, this is just some random person over here. We don't need to censor that, but I don't care what he thinks." Versus an institution that is pushing an agenda and what their motivations are. Like there's this law recently where websites had to start disclosing that they were making affiliate commissions and things, right? So you'd have all this like fake content about a particular product and they're making money off the referral, so now you have to put this line in there that says, hey, we might make a commission off this, so you understand the potential bias of that content.
Well, look, the other thing is you could do the movie rating system, right, where you say, we've had this system from MPAA for decades now that kind of gives you, imperfect as it is, but such sense about what you're about to walk into, right? When the lights dim and the images start to flicker, you don't want to be completely blown away by what you didn't expect. So there might be some content rating system that says either by user or by channel, we say we're not going to censor you, but we are going to rate you, right?
No, I think it should be a committee, and that's a great example because that's a neutral entity, right?
Hey, listen, you're a rated X poster.
Right.
So your account has been rated X. And so because of what you write about and what you post, right, we're saying you're posting explicit content. There's a big warning next to your account on Twitter. And if somebody wants to follow you, they can, but they know up front, this is different from following, right, a rated G account, which historically stays far away from where the edge might be. So that maybe an easier solution, instead of trying to cut out content and ban people, it's just to say, listen, based on your content history, we're just going to apply a rating. And if you want to follow a whole bunch of people who are rated X, right, on Facebook or whatever, then go right ahead. If not, then that's might be just a better option than saying, oh, someone has to go through line by line and say, oh, you violated this particular standard on Tuesday, then we change the standard on Wednesday, which happens a lot online, right, where they retroactively decide that something was okay on Monday and on Wednesday.
I think people are concerned about the government handling the censoring, which I get. I think people are concerned about a single entity business with motivation, with shareholder motivation, or maybe even political views. When you have the Jeff Bezoses of the world buying media companies, I get it. I mean, I don't agree with it all, but I do get the concern. So I think your motion picture is a great example of, hey, I think this is a neutral group made up of people probably from a bunch of different walks of life. And if you don't agree with their decision, it's not commercially motivated, and you think there's an appeals process, but it's a separate entity. You might not agree with every decision that they make, but it's a neutral entity, industry entity. I think we need. And by the way, it may even be a good thing, right? In the sense that, when I was 17, I was looking for X-rated content, right?
All right.
Exactly. That was the thing. If it was like PG-13, I was like, it's lame. I don't want to see that. So, I'm dating myself when you bought CDs and they started putting those labels on the CDs, right? I mean, some CDs sold better because of that.
If you have Apple Screen Time and you can see your kids, right? Apple gives you all these controls over what your kids can do or can't see, and it would be an interesting statistic to say, listen, your child's social media kind of universe is made up of 25% X-rated accounts, right? 20% R-rated accounts, or 50% PG, whatever it happens to be. That's a lot more useful than trying to figure out what any individual account is up to on any given day. So, right, again, just thinking out loud here, but there might be other solutions that involve just giving people information about the content that somebody produces that might be an easier thing to an easier way to solve the problem than to say, okay, we're going to start having a big fight over who gets to censor, right, whatever it happens to be. If this is a, like, call it, put a P next to, like, all right, this is a heavy duty political account, right? So great. You like politics, you want to get into it with this person on Twitter, go right ahead, right? That when you connect into that account, whatever that happens to be. So, by the way, there's another thing I think that the article was called The Death of the Internet. I think there's one other element to this, there's an article in Wired a couple of weeks ago, and the author talked about how much of the internet today to her looks like television circa 1961. And as this big thing about TikTok moving to video. Instagram moving to video, and the complaints from the traditional TikTok photography crowd because it's trying to compete with video-centric platforms. And the interesting question is she's posing is, to me, the internet looks just the way television did back then, when people called it, the FCC chair called it a cultural wasteland, and in a way, the internet has sort of followed the same way, right? The typical website is pretty ugly from a design standpoint, right? With banners and ads and stuff popping up. And as it becomes kind of this sort of free for all of video, we're sort of back to bad TV, but on exponentially more bad television.
Yeah.
So
it's the wild, wild west. And you mentioned earlier today this, Facebook trying to evolve into the metaverse world and really struggling to make it commercially viable, right?
Well, I connected that to the article on self-driving cars, right? And how after years and years of promise, that we're still so far from autonomous vehicles. And this autonomous vehicle thing is a story I follow for a long time, back to the original DARPA challenge, right? That sort of spawned the whole industry. And it, to me, is just this lesson about how hard it is to be truly innovative. These are very, very big problems. And we sometimes think of innovation as something that happens, the eureka moment, the spark that suddenly everything goes great. But I've worked and known with lots of innovators in science, right, and research, and in business and corporate settings, and it is a tough, years long, sometimes decades long process. And I think people who don't work in innovation roles sometimes don't quite understand just how difficult it is to kind of get these problems right. Real innovation is really difficult to do. This is just another example of that, right? It seems harder than what anybody imagined, although even the people who, when they wrote about it in the early days, knew how hard it was going to be.
Yeah. So, two things jumped out at me when I read this Bloomberg article this week. About how much money has been dumped into this technology. The first is, a correction for myself, right? I think I said last week that, these cars are safer than human drivers. According to the statistics in this article, that's incorrect. That the self-driving cars actually get into accidents more frequently, although there may be a caveat there of, the severity of accidents between the two. But the point is, they're not as far along as maybe the industry wants us to believe. But the other thing that jumps out at me, to your point, is again, I think the lens at which we look through these things is the wrong lens, and I think that lens is always shareholder earnings and public company value. That's why, as critical as people have been of Elon Musk, for example, I think it's the wrong conversation. I think the reason why he does a lot of the things that he does is because he doesn't care about the shareholder value. He wants to, just innovate, right? And I think it's, the world needs more people like him that, are willing to do that at the expense. You could say, okay, if I'm a shareholder, that's not good, but you're right. Innovation is a long path, and you can't, solve a problem of that level of complexity by next quarter's earnings report, right? It's just not that simple.
No, and the problems are, it's easy to take cheap shots, right? And there are moments in the article, I don't call them cheap shots, but they're funny. It starts with that woman who suddenly the Waymo cars, whatever it was, start using her driveway to make U-turns.
Right.
And there's just this continuous stream of cars coming to her house,
Which I think is hysterical, by the way. I wish I was there for that.
Her house happens to be the U-turn point, right, from the algorithm figured out. And it's like the people who complain about Waze, that suddenly, because of a construction, suddenly Waze starts sending 500 cars in front of their house, right? Because that's the algorithm says that is the best way to go. And those things are funny, but at the end of the day, these are really complicated problems, and it's going to take a lot of money and a lot of time to solve these things. It takes decades to solve. I mean, can you imagine getting just the idea that this vehicle is going to drive itself someplace, right? Makes you think about how amazing human beings are, but trying to replicate that with a person, that's another story.
Well, and the other thing is, like all these things, like a lot of these conversations we've had, the desire or the inclination is to look at these issues very black and white, very polarized, to say it's humans versus self-driving cars, and there's nothing in between. But the reality is, a lot of these advancements have made cars safer, right? A lot of these cars are safer, which plays more into the the concept of an augmented human AI automation world where you're better for it because of the safety technology that comes from this type of research.
And that's in many cases been the result, right? Maybe the ultimate goal wasn't reached as quickly as people thought, but along the way, things that were invented that begin to benefit. And I think you're absolutely right. I took a long trip this weekend and in a Volvo, and the Volvo has, right, basically the pilot system. And so it isn't that it's driving the car, but if in a moment I happen to look the other way, or you get distracted with your kids or whatever, it feels better that the Volvo is really kind of watching to make sure that nothing happens if for an instant, because as we know, a lot of times that's what an accident is, right? It's not that you decide to stop driving for 20 minutes or close your eyes for 15 minutes. It's the instantaneous lack of focus that results in the accident. And the fact that these systems are there, just kind of watching out for you, I think it's a huge advancement, even if we're not ready for full autonomy. I think what's there already is pretty amazing.
Yeah, the article mentions, this Bloomberg article mentions, a handful of the things. So it basically says that the cars are not there yet. That and by the way, this is kind of the funny difference for me, where they say the hardest thing for technology is to replicate human reasoning, and so I think they're learning more and more that there's a whole lot more reasoning that happens in driving than people originally thought. But if you look at their list of the top things that cause human accidents, they're all addressed by some of the technology that's out there because of this. Like you say, lane departure, car knowing when you're going to sleep, car knowing. I had a car that actually, maybe they all do it now, I don't know, that would actually detect an accident and adjust steering and seatbelts and things, to prepare you for that, right? So I think, you can't look at these things as black and white as,
No,
self-driving or not, right?
I'm a car guy, and I've been to racing school several times kind of over the years. And I was at a rally school in Florida, and I asked the instructor, boy, the roads here are so straight. How does anybody crash on a sunny afternoon? And he goes, it's pretty easy. The way you crash near Gainesville, he said, is that the road is so straight, you sort of take your eyes off the road for a second, you lose a wheel, right? One wheel comes off the road because the shoulder just sort of drops. You then overcorrect back, which moves the car too far to the left, which then you overcorrect a second time, and you're done. That's it. You're out of control, right? And so that little slip of the wheel over the shoulder, off the road, is what then creates this accident. Today, with vehicles that can read the lines and pull you a little bit back, right? How many accidents has that little simple thing of it just keeps you in the lane prevented, right? And so these, like I said, I think you're 100% right. I think this idea of like it's either a failure or it's the greatest or it's fantastic. That's not really how innovation works. Right? Real innovation is iterative most of the time, and it takes you 10 years to get that moment where suddenly everything falls into place and there's a success that you've been working on. My wife's a scientist, right? And I know with lots of scientists, and most of what scientists do fails. That's not what it's about, right? It's because you fail so many times that finally you find this right combination or the answer to a problem. And there are people who can work 10, 20 years, right, on one problem. And then if they're lucky, hopefully in the end, they find that answer. And I think we talk about being digital leader, right? I think that's what being a digital leader today is about in a way, right? We're in this decades-long transformation. You may see something that goes wrong at one point, but you have that vision to keep on going.
So I also wanted to ask you about this this article, Spirals of Delusion. It talks about AI and machine learning in the world of politics, and really broader than politics, really down to our society, capitalists versus dictatorships and things, and whether advancements in AI will actually accelerate capitalism versus kind of dictatorship. Did you see this? What were your thoughts on this article?
Well, it laid out this debate, right, in the AI community, whether AI and technology is a force to advance democracy, right? I'd say, or it actually enables tyranny, and this is a prominent debate, not just in the AI community, but in the political science as well. How do authoritarian regimes use technology for control, right? Or does technology enable freedom? And we see great examples of both every single day. Right? You see where social media allows news to filter into heavily censored countries, right? We saw with Arab Spring, where these movements were driven by social media, and you have technology driving democracy sort of forward. At the same time, you absolutely can see in authoritative or very heavily controlled regimes where social credit systems, movement controls, digital fingerprinting, right, being able to track your entire life online makes it a lot easier for somebody who wants to control a population to do so. So my sense that it operates to both ends at the same time.
Yeah, it was interesting. It actually made two distinct arguments. One saying it perpetuates democracy, or it's a challenge to democracy because it's leveraging so much feedback, from an open society to the machine learning engines learns from people, and so it becomes this. Again, we were talking before about the web becoming this kind of wild west, right? If it's learning based on what it perceives is the consensus of the larger community, then it almost becomes maybe it goes rogue too easily, as we've talked about in the past. The Microsoft AI chat chat bias from a number of years ago. But on the other hand, it's scary in the context of dictatorships and things where you're right. Obviously there's the privacy issues, but also where an authoritarian government just keeps being reinforced on their own echo chamber of what's happening, and now they instead of it being just their opinion or the opinion of some of the people around them, now there's actually data that backs up their extreme positions, right?
Look, there's been a long history of authoritarian regimes using information as a means of control, right? Fear, propaganda, paranoia. The Stasi, right after World War II, was a kind of textbook case of you didn't know who was a spy, you didn't know who was an informant, you didn't know, so you had to assume that everybody was. In this particular case, the technology does all that. If you're an authoritarian, it just does all that for you, right? It's checking every email, it's checking every text, it's checking every message that's being sent out. And if it can then say, okay, here we have a cluster of activity that looks like it's anti-government, right, or anti the official party line, it swoops in. And authoritarian governments typically aren't too picky about what they scoop up, right? You have to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. It isn't like they're going to worry about how they got 1 out of the 13 people they rounded up was actually innocent. That's the real issue. And the way AI works is we don't see it. We don't see it. And this is why I think it's so scary to people, that because you don't understand it. I've written about this a lot, which is that the moment you stop understanding how an important feature of society works, now you have a problem, right? And we have this in America today. I think personally, with respect to Wall Street, right? 50 years ago, people thought they understood how Wall Street worked. I don't think the average person today is going to say, oh, I understand, right, how Wall Street works anymore. Higher ed, Washington, right, government, healthcare, the best example. You used to have a doctor. You saw the doctor, right? You paid the bill. That's kind of how it worked. There was a nurse. Today it's HMOs, PPOs. There's 75 different line items in the bills. People just give up. And so I think that this is a problem, I think, for the AI innovation community. If people don't understand how it works, they're just going to assume in many cases the worst, which is kind of what happens to other areas, right? And so they get extremely defensive about it. And it's very easy to walk in and say, you don't get it, I get it. And let me tell you how it works. It's really bad. And now you get the pushback. And I don't think there's been enough education about what these systems do and how they operate. And I understand there are all these claims about, well, it's a secret sauce and I can't talk about it because it's going to ruin my competitive advantage. I don't know. I wonder how true that is most of the time.
Yeah, I call it black box syndrome, right? People
Right.
just they can't see in it, or they don't want to see in it, or if they do, they can't understand what's in it, and these things continue to operate. But you're right in the sense that it used to be a debate of whether we should go this route or not. It's already that path has already been set.
Right.
So
We're on the road.
yeah, right. We got to figure that. And I think back to our conversation about categorization and ratings and things like that. I think people need to understand. It used to be when you wrote an article that you had to cite your sources, right? I think you have to at least you might not have to give away the secret sauce, but you got to kind of at least cite your sources as to what factors this engine is using. Otherwise, and maybe that's the appeal of the democratic versus the totalitarian government using it, where you could say at least in theory, freedom of information, people in a democratic society should have some level of visibility into the algorithms that drive their and some recourse, right? So that if all of the cars in San Francisco start making 3-point turns in your driveway, you have some recourse.
Well, I'll give you an interesting example, which is just simply self-identification, right? There is in the AI philosophy community, right? There are people who are extremely passionate about the idea that an AI should always let you know that you're talking to it. And I think words to that effect are sort of in the AI bill that was passed in the European Union a couple of years ago, that it sort of began to lay out this idea that if you're talking to a machine, the machine must self-identify as such, right? We don't have that in the United States. For whatever reason, we don't care. But this is a huge issue, right? If you don't know that you're talking to a machine, that becomes sort of the first step with the machine impersonating human beings, which means that at that point, right, who are you calling? Let's say you call the police to report a potential crime. You think you're talking to an officer. You think the officer will just understand when you say, I don't want to say my name or whatever, right? You assume humanity in your counterpart, but there isn't any, right? And so the AI takes everything you said, runs it through its process, right? And suddenly you've got a problem. So I think just as one,
I think some of the humans that I speak to also lack humanity. So what is what's the difference?
well, this is a debate, right? It is, what would you rather have? I tend to personally lean on the side of those who say, if it's a machine, I'd like to know it's a machine. But in this country, I'm probably in the minority. Mostly for the way we act commercially sort of seems to imply that we don't really care, right? If the machine takes the call and is helping us, then so be it. We don't get that worried about it.
I
But
think what's more important to me is to know whether it's a machine or not. I mean, obviously, I'm being a little bit dramatic to make a point, but I'm less concerned with whether it's a human or a machine, as those two entities seem more and more similar sometimes, especially in customer service interactions. I'd be more interested in knowing what their prejudices are. Right. So back to that ratings system idea. Like, I'd love to know, the reference table, the bibliography, the history, right? Just like if I speak to if you're on a sales team, you typically do whatever research you can about someone that you're speaking to before you have a meeting with them. Or if you're in politics, you do competitor research. And I just like to know. I'd like to know what the potential biases are, of Carlos before I speak to you or do business with you, and of the AI, who programmed it, where do the engines come from, what data points is it using, just so I know. Because like the content and like the journalism and the social media, if you understand the vantage point, the lens at which that person or thing looks at the world, then you can make your own decisions. But if you don't, and you assume that it's neutral, which I think is a misnomer, but then that's when things become challenging.
Well, I'll tell you one final story from another time, and that is, I know the CEO of a phenomenal small software testing company called Ultranauts, right? And Rajesh Anandan is the CEO's name. Well, he's a co-founder. And one of the things that makes Ultranauts unique is that most of its workforce is on the autism spectrum, as is my younger son. And one of my favorite stories about Ultranauts is somebody mentioned at one point the idea that it's very difficult for some people on the spectrum to understand social cues that sort of non-spec people will just automatically pick up. They have a hard time picking it up. And I see it with my son. And so somebody said, what's too bad people don't have an FAQ. So if we have an FAQ, then I would know this is everything I need to know about this person. And they said, well, why not? Why can't we have an FAQ? And so they decided to make it a policy that everybody would have an FAQ. And the FAQ would have things like, what's the best time to call? How would you like to be contacted? Do you prefer text or email or a call? Or is there a time that you don't want to be disturbed? Whatever. And so, and this thing ended up being called a biodex, right? And everyone in the company from CEO on down has a biodex. And well, I know it works in this company. Back to your point, I don't know why every company doesn't have a biodex, right? It would be a lot easier before you work with somebody for the first time, or to meet someone, to say, I'm going to download Dan Goodstein's biodex, right? Read the FAQ about Dan. And to your point, that gives me information that I can use before I begin interacting with you, right? And again, I think there's so many things that can be solved by just better labeling. So right, this is a machine, this is a human you're speaking to, right? This is the biodex for your new boss, right? Or your new boss is a machine. This is the way the machine is programmed and what it likes and what it doesn't like. We are already in the age of machine bosses, right? And so I don't think that has the labeling, if you want to call it that, right? The labeling that we take for granted in so much of society has not kept up with the innovation and AI and technology.
Yep. No, good conversation, Carlos. And before we jump, I wanted to give you an opportunity. You made an announcement yesterday about a foundation that you've started. So can you tell everybody a little bit about that before we go?
Yeah, thank you, Dan. So I wanted to mention to everyone something called the Enzo for Sports Foundation, and it's www.enzoforsports.org. And it is a foundation that launched yesterday in honor of my son. My late son, Enzo, died early this year. He died on June 1st. He was killed in an bicycling crash with a car. And he was, at the time of his death, a freshman at the University of Maryland, Merrill School of Journalism. His dream was to be a sports journalist, and not just any sports journalist. And by that, I mean that Enzo was very socially conscious. He was focused on, I think, the stories of sports that have a social impact, the stories of sports that sort of show humanity at its best, right? And trying to overcome and to do things that we may think are impossible. He was working as a side project on a documentary on Lonnie Bias, the athlete who died at University of Maryland. And so when Enzo died, our family wanted to, we didn't want the good work that he would do for others to stop because he wasn't with us any longer. And so what the foundation's goal is two things. One is to support financially sports journalism students who are in college, and especially those who are working on stories of social impact. And then in a broader sense, to promote the idea that athletes who have a special role in our society, right, who are privileged and who we look up to, especially young people, that we encourage them through journalism to speak out on behalf of making our society a better place. So I hope anyone who's watching or listening will take a moment. You can visit, like I said, enzoforsports.org, learn a little bit about Enzo, about the foundation. And if you'd like to support it, I would be deeply grateful. Thank you, Dan.
Thank you. No, thank you, Carlos. Great idea to kind of keep the goal of your son going, and it's a great cause. So please check it out. We're supporting it and promoting it to all of our members. If you watching could also share that out to your networks, we'd really appreciate it. Carlos, thank you. And again, everybody, you can catch us each week, Wednesdays at noon Eastern, 9 Pacific, 6 Central European time. And if you need help with your digital transformation, anything that you're working on, let us know. We're here to help, and powered by this network of over 130,000 executives now. So let us know what you're working on, and check out DEInetwork.com. Thanks, everybody, and have a great week.
Thank you, Dan. See you next week. Bye-bye.